themselves against the onslaught of the Hun, and under the dark cloak of the blackout, various draft dodgers, spivs, con men and other social undesirables prey upon decent folk. But help is at hand. There is a masked costume vigilante who haunts the night, preying on these vermin. His name? Tim Lobster Matthews.
Thank you. I thought that was a proposition. I'm going to turn this off because I don't know my microphone.
No, can you keep it on? We won't be able to record it without you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can't follow an introduction like that, can you? My name's Tim Matthews, the most controversial man in ufology, which is odd because I'm not even involved in ufology anymore. But what I wanted to do today was talk to you about some of the things that over the years I've discovered about flying saucers and flying triangles, which most people have seen in terms of UFO sightings over the years. Now, I should start by saying I'm not telling you this afternoon that I have the answer to all UFO sightings. I'm just telling you about some of the better ones, okay? So if you believe in aliens or whatever, that's fine, because this is almost a separate issue. But certainly, over the years, people have been encouraged to believe all kinds of stories about aliens and their involvement with flying saucers. And that has been part of a long-term CIA project to cover up the development of their own human technologies. And I wrote about this in a book called UFO Revelation, not my title, that was published in 1999. It sold out within a few months and did particularly well in America, but then I suppose that's nothing to write home about because the Americans believe in almost anything, wouldn't they? Especially if you've seen a Todd Bentley revival on the God Channel, but you can tell how bored I sometimes get. So John asked me to talk about UFOs. I haven't done a talk about UFOs for 7 years. And I've forgotten just about everything I used to know, so what I had to do over the last few weeks was start to remember what I used to know about this subject. Some of you may know some of this, some of you may not, but it certainly gives you an entirely different set of thoughts and information about ufology than that which is normally presented. And I used to get in a lot of trouble about all this kind of stuff, but we won't go into that. Let's just have a look at the first slide. Slides, incidentally, are here not for your benefit, they're just to remind me what I was supposed to be talking about, okay? So we'll have a look in... This is about the modern UFO wave, incidentally. This is not about things that people saw in Malta in 1652, okay? Because throughout history, people have seen all kinds of things they couldn't explain. And I've had ghost sightings and poltergeist experiences. I'm a hands-on healer and all that kind of stuff, so we'll leave all that to one side, okay? Because at the end of the day, if people want to believe something, they're going to believe it. It doesn't matter what I tell you. If you've got strong beliefs about something, they will remain strong beliefs. And whatever evidence I gave you about flying saucers, if you think they're recovered from Roswell and they keep aliens at the base at Wright-Patterson or something in Hangar 13 or Hangar 18 or wherever it is, then I'm not going to change your mind. But you might find some of this information interesting. Now, you will notice from some of these documents, not particularly easy to see. That's because of my total lack of ability in terms of PowerPoint. But nevertheless, you can see that that's a document, and I happen to know that it was written in November 1947, previously classified. And so, when people started to first look into the whole question of flying saucers back in the 1940s, they wouldn't have known this information. And you might be forgiven for thinking that people were quite legitimate in coming to conclusions about aliens and flying saucers if they had no other information to go on. And incidentally, I should say that if anybody's interested in seeing these documents so you can actually read them properly, then I'm quite happy to make them available to you. But this document here talks about German flying saucer projects. It's not something that is some deep, dark attempt to indoctrinate people into believing in occult Nazism. It's just an American intelligence document that tells you in the bottom paragraph that the Americans in 1947-48 believed that flying saucers certainly had a relationship with German technology, and that the canvas and interest in that subject was to be maintained at the highest level of secrecy, and that's what that document says. It actually says at the bottom the whole idea of our survey into flying saucers that may have been planned plans that may have been developed by the Germans is to be kept secret and to obscure our interest in the subject. That's words which have been found in Whitehall documents as well. This document here talks about sightings of flying saucers in and around secret facilities in Leningrad, in Russia. And the Americans had what appears to be some reasonably good information that the Soviets had some sort of flying saucer technology. As to how clever these things were in terms of their abilities whilst in flight, it's very difficult to say, but the point is that it appears that the Soviets in 1950 had a flying saucer. It was seen by some of the American assets in Russia, and that makes life very interesting because it certainly appears from the research I've done and others have done that both the Americans and the Soviets had a disc-plane type aircraft back in the 1940s. And this is not something that sits well with ufologists because the story has always been, as I'm sure you know, that aliens landed in Roswell in 1947, and before that human technology was extremely backward. We couldn't do anything at all, and it was all down to the aliens. And that's been a focus for ufology, particularly American ufology, since the various early days of the post-war flying saucer flap. And of course there's a reason for that, and that is that the American military wanted people to believe in aliens, and so they did their best to obscure the real truth, which was that they and the Soviets, of course, were working on highly secret flying saucer technology. This is a bit clearer, and this is something I've written word for word from the Twining Memorandum, which is a very famous ufological document, data shown, and at the bottom we see something very interesting indeed. And this document was also not classified or not declassified, so we couldn't look at it until I think 1994 or 1995. So in other words, almost 50 years had gone by before this document was made public. And it says at the bottom, the possibility that these objects, in other words UFOs or flying saucers, are of domestic origin, the product of some high security project not known to this command. So here we have an admission from the American Air Force that it's quite likely that flying saucer sightings are the result of, as it says there, something of domestic origin. And it also says in the italic paragraph above that it would be possible to construct a piloted aircraft which has the general description of the flying saucer seen with an approximate range of 7,000 miles at subsonic speeds, which is several hundred miles an hour. An interesting aside is that most UFO sightings, or flying saucer sightings as they were called in the 1940s, did not relate to things going thousands of miles an hour. There was all kinds of different sightings, but when it was a saucer, most of the time the saucer was seen to fly between 300 and 600 miles an hour. Not really evidence of alien technology, but let us move on. That is a real UFO photograph, and it's taken of a saucer or pancake type looking object in 1947 in Arizona. It was taken by a guy called Mr. William Rhodes, and it's very interesting in bearing in mind what we've just seen, that this thing was seen at the time. Now, it's always been said that that is evidence of alien craft, but one thing you have to bear in mind with UFO research is that in terms of aircraft shapes, the two best shapes for aircraft are triangle and circle. The circular discs are very, very difficult to control, but the point is that if you were going to come in from space and you had that advanced technology, you wouldn't need to have a triangle or a circle, because triangular and circular craft operate best within an atmosphere. In other words, Earth-type craft. These are the same photographs, taken from different angles, got the date on there again, Phoenix, Arizona, 1947. It's always been said that we couldn't have had anything like this at the time, although obviously this plane wasn't going 5,000 miles an hour, otherwise he wouldn't have got the picture, would he? It was probably doing a few hundred miles an hour, if I remember my notes. And we have more pictures. And as you'll come to see, there's quite strong evidence that these are man-made UFOs. Not unlike that thing on the left there, similar sort of shape. Look at that there, look at that there. I get in a lot of trouble for mentioning the fact that the Germans may have had plans and experiments at whatever stage, some advanced, some not so advanced, back in the 1940s, because of course when we're looking into flying saucers and we start to talk about German aircraft projects, they immediately become Nazi UFOs. And if you call something Nazi and then you add the term UFO to it, people don't want to talk about it for politically correct reasons, which is a shame. But if we move on and look at more documents, what was actually going around the time in in the Air Force and intelligence communities. Again, we see another document from 1949, AIR 100-20379, which I wrote about in my book, which is called UFO Revelation. That's not an advert, you can't get it anymore. So, no cheap shot there. The document produced in 1949 came to the similar conclusions to the document we'd seen before. The above tends to indicate that some type of object has been seen, and the possibility exists that the object or objects seen are conventional domestic devices, such as weather balloons, test rockets, or jet-equipped aircraft with pancake or flying wing configurations. Like that. So you've all been told they're aliens and they landed at Roswell. Well, considering that that photograph was taken almost exactly the same time as the Roswell incident, it would have been a hell of a feat of back engineering to have it flying at the same time as the Roswell thing crashed. Because, of course, the logic of the UFO community who believe in back-engineered or recovered technology is that they got hold of this alien craft and didn't really know what to do with it. It's only now that some of the technology is coming on tap, so that doesn't really make any sense, because that thing was seen, and we now discover that some of the UFOs, or the objects being reported in such great numbers, some of them, I emphasise, could be jet-equipped aircraft with pancake or flying wing configurations. Now you might think to yourself, well, he's only telling us something that we could have worked out for ourselves. But the only thing is, at the time, it was denied that any such project existed. It was always said, in terms of UFOs, that we don't know what they are. And the documents from which I take this research, and took it previously, all of which was classified until recently, the argument always was from the military and the powers that be, we don't know what these things are. We don't know what they are. We don't have any projects like that. And yet, at the very same time they were saying that, they were actually admitting privately in top secret rated documents that they actually did have jet-equipped aircraft with pancake or flying wing configurations. Now, the flying wing configurations could have been a Northrop plane, one of the wing-shaped things they were working on at the time, but certainly pancake configuration aircraft have always been denied. So here in front of your very eyes, you're seeing an admission from the American military that they did have top secret projects which could produce something which might be responsible in some cases for a small number of UFO sightings. And that's the whole point about UFOs, isn't it? A UFO researcher is supposed to identify the object. He's not supposed to sit there going, oh, I believe I've been on board a spacecraft. He's supposed to find out what it is that people are seeing, but ufologists aren't very good at that. Because most people get involved with ufology because they want to be special and seem to be more intelligent than you because they believe in aliens. Anyway, that interesting little thing there was made by a company called Chance Vo, V-O-U-G-H-T. You're going to see more about them later. Now, this is another one of those projects that has always been said, the official story has been that that thing was scrapped in 1947, despite the fact it had shown some remarkable abilities to rise very quickly, to hover, and to manoeuvre in unusual ways. Exactly the same sort of unusual ways that UFO witnesses, or flying saucer witnesses, were reporting having taken place. Now, from the final conclusions of the documents I mentioned before, AIR 100-20379, we come to the conclusion that although we can't fully explain the phenomenon of flying saucers, well, that's not really a surprise, because some are meteorological, some are astronomical, some are paranormal, the things that people were reporting. It says, as you can see, the possibility of unconventional type aircraft being the cause of flying disc reports. This must not be overlooked. Now, if the people investigating UFO sightings had known these things back in the 1940s, it's quite possible that a completely different set of conclusions would have been reached. And that plane is very interesting because although it was said to be scrapped in 1947, all the old clever clogsers within the aviation community and the UFO community, all the skeptics, always say, oh well, you know, the history books tell us that that plane was scrapped. Well, actually, that plane wasn't scrapped. They continued making that thing for 15, 20 years after this photograph was taken, and they got more advanced and more manoeuvrable. One of the reasons I know, that will come to another later on, is because I interviewed a guy who worked on that aircraft. He lived in a place called Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is part of the Amish community, and his name was Thomas C. Smith. And I interviewed him for my book. This was in 1997. Obviously, he was quite an old chap at the time. And he told me the story about what really happened to these things, and that was that they'd taken them to a base in California. interestingly enough, the same base in California are where some of the most popular, famous or infamous UFO sightings of the original 1947-48 set happened at Muroc Air Force Base, or Muroc Field in California. That's what people reported seeing, a disc-shaped craft travelling at around 300 miles per hour in exactly the same place where the military denied they had the plane, where they denied they had a project. UFO sightings of that kind of craft by some reasonably credible witnesses. I should say, by the way, I always say reasonably credible, because when you've been involved in ufology for quite some time, you'd be amazed what people expect you to believe. And we can't just base UFO research on what people tell us. We have to do it on the basis of photos and documents. We have to put the whole picture together, which is what I'm trying to do here. So that aircraft was never destroyed, and Thomas Smith told me that there were all kinds of secret things going on with this aircraft, including special skins and a whole range of other technology to do with it, which makes sense and will help us to explain at least one or two of the early flying saucer sightings. Now this is just obvious really, and I've mentioned before this business of why you would use a triangle and a saucer. Anybody in aeronautics will tell you that the best shapes are triangles and saucers, so it doesn't make a great deal of logical sense to suggest that aliens are in them, but that's never stopped people. That is, I wish it was a bit clearer, but let's not worry about that. You'll have to take my word for it. It's not the sort of thing you're going to make up. But this is sort of the Holy Grail as far as boring sods like me who spend all their time talking about flying saucers are concerned. This document, which was now unclassified, as you can see at the top, was previously a classified document, part of Project Sign, which was the American military's early efforts on the surface to find out what people were seeing, because they were so concerned about UFO sightings. One of the reasons the Americans were so concerned is because they thought the Russians had similar technology, and as you know, one thing about the Cold War is if the Americans had it and the Russians had it, they wanted to compete with each other. And if they didn't have it, they wanted to convince the other side that they did. This document here, which has been released for some time within the UFO community and is actually available on one or two websites, would you believe, has clearly never actually been looked at by any UFO researcher, because this document tells you that the Navy, who are probably the prime suspects in terms of where UFOs come from, the sort of UFOs I'm talking about, that document admits there that the Navy has an experimental plane which is exactly like a flying saucer. Exactly the same sort of experimental plane they have always denied existed. And again, I can make that document available to you in much clearer format if you want a copy, but believe me, that's what it says. It says that the Navy has an X-plane which would explain some of the UFO sightings, but you never heard that at your UFO lectures before. And, oh, I've even done it clearer so you can actually see it. Isn't that good of me? There we go. B, the Navy has an X-airplane built by VOUGHT, V-O-U-G-H-T. You remember the company that built the aircraft they told you didn't exist? Well, this document tells you in 1948, a year after that plane is supposedly scrapped, that the flying disc is built by the same company and it's an experimental airplane. And this is a year after the project was supposedly cancelled. So we nail one lie. And that's actually quite important. You might not think it's earth-shakingly important, but for the first time we have it in black and white from a previously classified, highly classified document, always denied that the Navy had an experimental aircraft which would appear to be similar to the flying saucers that were being seen at the time. It might not rock your boat, but it certainly rocks ours, because it puts us on a trail. And it puts us on a trail which suggests that for a number of highly complicated reasons, flying saucer sightings are nothing to do with alien spacecraft at all, and everything to do with a range of experimental aircraft. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that these aircraft made it into service. It doesn't mean you can nip down a museum and see it. But the point is that these things did indeed exist, and this has always been denied. And every single time you get a lecture from America talking about UFOs, there is one thing they are always absolutely sure about. And that is that there is no possibility, and I know because I've spoken to these people, and some of you will have too, that the military had flying disc technologies. And we're not talking about anti-gravity devices either, we're talking about jet-powered, or you saw before, propeller-powered aircraft. Because remember, when you're looking at a UFO, if you think it's a military plane, you think, that's quite interesting. If you think it's a flying saucer from Mars, you think you're really special, and yet you've been in contact. And no doubt later, when you go under hypnosis, you'll start to have abduction scenarios taking place in your life. That's if you're really unlucky. That's one good reason not to get involved in ufology, because it messes with your head. So, you know it's true. Now, absolutely. You've got tablets for that. Now, this is a document that appeared in a magazine in 1947, and it talks about the real flying saucer. It's very boring and very aircrafty type stuff. But if you look at the bottom paragraph, it talks about this plane which is flying at around 300 miles an hour, and it talks about the Charles Vaux Zimmerman. Zimmerman was the guy who invented the Americans' secret flying saucers, and Vaux was one of the companies that built it. And notice they call it a helicopter aeroplane. And the whole 5-page article goes on to say how easy it would be to build a more advanced version of this thing. So, real flying saucer? Absolutely. And this is the story I told you before. Now this one, can't even remember what that was about, so we won't talk about that, or that one. But let's get on to this, because as usual, time is against us. You will be interested to know that one of the people behind the flying saucers that have been seen was English, and his name was John Carver Frost, and he worked for a company called Avro, A-V-R-O, and he was the one who designed lots of the flying saucers that were subsequently flown in and around Groom Lake in the 1960s, and you may remind me to tell you a story about that. There was a thing called Project Silverbug, Project Y2, out of which came all kinds of requirements for flying saucers. These were American Air Force projects. There he is, a tiny saucer, seeing a bit of a test on it. No, that's not one that somebody saw. That's the guy again. But this is one of his patents from 1962, by which time he'd stopped taking an active part in flying saucer technology. Just show you some other pictures of the thing there. Looks a little bit like a UFO, doesn't it? And this is one of dozens of patents that he put forward at the time. That's actually a mock-up of one of the craft they actually did test. And as you can see, it looks a bit like an alien spacecraft, or should I say a man-made disc plane. And these photographs were discovered by a chap called Bill Rose, who's a noted aviation writer and a friend of mine. I've been working with him for 10 years on and off. It wasn't just my research, some of this, it was a group of us. There was a guy called David Windle, who was a science correspondent for the Times newspaper and also wrote freelance for magazines. There was a guy called John Locker, who is a satellite communications expert. There was me, the man with the big mouth who went on TV, and also Bill, who used to do things like dig through archives and find these photographs. Now, if you'd seen something like that flying the sky in the 1950s, you would have thought it was an alien spacecraft, but no, it was made in a factory in Canada and subsequently tested at a number of facilities in America. There's another picture of it. Some people call it the flying shovel, but the point is well made. Now, this is from an article in Look magazine from 1955. Is this the real flying saucer? This is talking about an Air Force project that was for a quite advanced vehicle. They wanted to develop this. They developed this one through the 1950s, and we believe they started testing this one at Groom Lake, Area 51. It wasn't called Area 51, I don't think, in around 1958-59. We know this because one of the people that Bill Rose interviewed for a book he was going to write called Shadowcraft, he wrote another more dry academic book, a guy called Dan Carlson, and he recently passed on, and he spoke to Deborah Carlson, his wife, told us a fascinating story about the testing of man-made flying saucers at Groom Lake. And of course you've all heard the stories about Groom Lake, haven't you? Area 51, Bob Lazar, Antigravity, aliens. And the alien part of it is just to cover, to make people believe that the technologies that they're seeing in the sky when they're tested are not man-made, but of alien origin. And from that article on the left, we see how flying saucers wouldn't need a runway, obviously not because they ascend vertically, they're vertical takeoff aircraft, or STOVL aircraft, short takeoff, vertical landing aircraft, exactly what you expect from your flying saucers you've seen on the invaders and the X-Files, and they would have camouflaged them underground. And that's probably where part of these stories about underground bases come from. Because underground bases are real. It's just a question of whether you believe they have aliens in them that eat strawberry ice cream. That's real, by the way. That was a story that we were all expected to believe a while ago, that aliens ate strawberry ice cream, and one of them was called J-Rod. I suppose if you believe that, you'll believe anything. And as you can see, really credible name for the author there, Commander X. Good friend of John Downes. He's now passed away, apparently. It's lovely, isn't it, when they tell you that somebody called Commander X has died. I mean, why do you send flowers? You know what I mean? So, this is another interesting thing that points us in a certain direction. We've only got about 50 years to catch up with ufology here, because ufologies have 50 years to fill your minds with stories about aliens and abductions and men in black and all that kind of exciting stuff. So we're starting really 40 to 50 years behind in terms of trying to bring people a story about what really happened in terms of flying saucers, and some of the reasons as to why they would keep these things quiet. Now, Jack Pickett is a very, very important individual, and that's because in 1962 he was, I should point out, a highly decorated combat veteran, but who by 1962 was retired and was working on MacDill Air Force Base. And at MacDill Air Force Base, he was driving out one day on a job and happened to come across, frankly, a graveyard of flying saucers, graveyard of flying discs. Not anti-gravity machines, no little grey men, no aliens eating ice cream, just a number of different size flying saucers. And he went to the base commander and he said, basically, what the hell is going on? What's this you've got at the end of the airbase in a sort of restricted area? And basically he was debriefed and told by American intelligence that yes, we do have these flying saucers, you've seen them, and that these ones that you can see here don't fly anymore, they're former experimental aircraft. And one of the very interesting things is that one of the markings on the side of one of the aircraft, because of course he took lots of notes about this, suggested that that company on the bottom line there was involved in constructing these discs. This is in 1962. You may remember I showed you a picture of that thing with the propellers, made by the Chance Vaux Company. What it looks like 1962. Another sighting of flying discs, man-made, admitted to be such by the American military, also involved that company. Bell had something to do with it as well. On the side of aircraft, they always have markings, and sometimes you can tell from the markings who has made that particular craft. Well, in this case, this is what we were able to determine. So Jack Pickett, a very, very important man. He's been featured in one UFO documentary, but it's interesting. If he had done a Bob Lazar and said he'd been involved with a military project involving aliens, extraterrestrials, recovered technology from Roswell and all the rest, he would have probably had a best-selling book by now. But because he told the truth, nobody's really interested, which I think is a great shame. But that's okay, because we'll do our best to bring this story out, and we're also doing our best to track things down, because I have been strongly encouraged to write another book about all this, so it looks like I might just have to do that, which will be good, be better than the first one. And we engaged a chap in America to work with Jack Pickett to get us as near as, damn it, what these things look like. And that's what they look like. That was the biggest of the three. There was a small 8-foot one as well, but that was the biggest. And obviously, I mean, that's not a real picture of them rolling the thing out, you know, Ronald Reagan or George Bush, whoever standing there. But this is what these things would have looked like from a number of different perspectives. And this, of course, takes us back to our initial comments in those previously highly classified documents about domestic projects of circular and pancake design, which the American military knew existed. We'll come on to something else very interesting in a moment as well. That's another picture of what he said it looked like. Nothing particularly exciting about it, it's just a flying disc, but it doesn't come from space, and none of the technology does either, it's just man-made stuff. One of the interesting things about being involved in ufology is a lot of people, and you might find this in other areas as well, particularly people who are interested in the whole alien thing, is they have a very dim view of what people, humans, are capable of doing. You know, they normally don't like themselves, and they normally don't like humanity, and so they tend to subscribe to some great god or alien out there who's going to come down and solve all our problems, a bit like when Jesus comes back, you know, for the second coming. You just replace that with aliens and you've got a really pretty story, haven't you? Unfortunately, it's completely at variance with the facts. So that's just another picture of a thing called WS-606, Weapons System 606, which is something that John Frost, the English guy I showed you a picture of before, was working on. That was actually a disc interceptor. These flying discs apparently had a number of different uses, okay? Surveillance being one of them, testing radical forms of propulsion was another one, and this thing was just an interceptor. One of the things we discovered, one of the reasons the Americans were so concerned about flying saucers is their belief that the Russians had them. And the fact that the Russians were probing the radar systems of America with a number of technologies in the 1950s and 60s, which is exactly what you would expect at the height of the Cold War. And this was something the Americans proposed might be a solution to dealing with Russian intrusions into their airspace, and there was lots of different plans and models. We think this thing flew in the mid-1960s. That's another picture of it from the official documents, and just an explanation of what they are. Now this is very interesting, and before we come on to the Wright-Patterson story, we will talk about something which is even more unusual, and this is anti-gravity. Now those of you who've taken an interest in anti-gravity may know that this is always said to be the Holy Grail, because if you can conquer gravity, you could have effectively some sort of a flying vehicle that could go in all kinds of different directions. Now on my laptop I do actually have a video taken from Area 51 Groom Lake which shows a saucer-shaped vehicle in 1994 doing those kinds of manoeuvres. And this group, again interestingly based in London, was sponsored by elements of the American military to write a report about so-called anti-gravity systems. And if you read the whole document through, what's very interesting is how advanced they were in terms of their understanding and practical techniques in terms of the technology. But Wright Aeronautical Labs Technical Library is where this previously classified document lived until 1990. Very few people take any interest in it, and ufologists and people who study these things rarely comment on it because it gives an alternative perspective as to where flying saucers may come from. Let's just talk a little bit about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Those of you UFO people in the audience will know that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is the place where Project Blue Book, the official US investigation into UFOs, was housed. It's also the place where all their secret flying saucer technology programs were housed, and also the place which was involved in research into anti-gravity systems. It's very interesting, isn't it, how Wright-Patterson Air Force Base has been associated by American UFO researchers, many of them who are former military, former intelligence people, all telling you that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is where they have recovered alien technology, bodies recovered from alien spacecraft. And don't you think it's a little bit interesting, don't you think it's a little bit surprising that the place where they have all this man-made technology is also the place where you're expected to believe they have alien bodies and recovered alien spaceships? It suggests to me that that is just a cover for what's really going on, which are these highly advanced systems. Now, this thesis doesn't really rely upon a belief in anti-gravity, because who knows how far they've got with it. But the interesting thing about that report, which goes right back to 1956, is that it argued this. Using a number of assumptions as to the nature of gravity, we postulate, wait for it, a saucer as the basis of a possible interceptor with a Mach 3 capabilities. That's what, 2,800 miles an hour. Such a disk would confer on the aircraft sharp-edged changes of direction typical of motion in space and typical of what people report in some UFO sightings. Aliens or humans, you decide. But if it was human, you can understand why the alien cover story would be so convincing. Now, I don't think that's going to work. No, it isn't. That, disappointingly, for all kinds of technological reasons, is a video showing a former CIA analyst called Melvin Goodman, and he was a senior analyst, admitting, and you can come and look at this on my laptop later on if you want, that's not a problem, admitting that they used the UFO community to cover up the development of their own highly advanced aircraft. The CIA admitting this in black and white. The guy comes on, he's sitting in a restaurant with another one of my colleagues who writes for Jane's Defence Weekly, called Nick Cook, who's written some really good books on flying saucers and done a couple of TV documentaries on the subject. He admits that they actually went to the lengths of making friends with people within the UFO research community with a view to putting out these stories about aliens and just about anything that would cover their tracks. Very sensible thing to do. If you try telling a UFO researcher that for the last 40 or 50 years they have been victim of a cunning plot by the Americans to divert attention from the real technological advances. We'll come on to see the human costs of this fairly shortly. But we're going to move on now to something a little bit nearer to home, and something very personal to me. British flying triangles, or flying triangle sightings that have been seen in Britain. This was something I got into a lot of trouble about, because at one point we had lots of people actually camped around Air Force bases in this country and various other places watching out for flying triangles. That doesn't make you very popular with the military, I can tell you. I was doing a conference in 1997 talking about this thing, HALO, High Altitude Low Observable Craft. Let's just have a look at a picture of it. There it is. That thing underneath, not the thing with the wings, okay? That's called a Proteus. And that, which is something which British Aerospace has just started to cut the metal for, that's called Taranis, which is the Celtic god of something or other. They always give planes sexy names, don't they? So people don't do such sexy things when they're bombing people, but that's another story. And this is a lot of waffle about British stealth. But in 1993 and 4, along the West Lancashire coast and the Cumbrian coast, a small black triangle was seen by hundreds of witnesses under escort by RAF tornadoes, which tends to suggest these things don't come from outer space, and this is separate to the flying saucers I was talking about. We had a group called Lancashire UFO Society. It was basically set up to track this particular project, and it got to the point where people from British Aerospace were coming to us, telling us what was going on, and at the same time threatening me that if I continued to do this research, horrible things would happen to me. And actually, not even privately, actually in my face, in front of 120 people, this guy from British Aerospace said, if you don't stop doing this research, the Americans will be really unhappy. And subsequently, my name was dirt, because spookdom moves in mysterious ways when it wants to stop you looking into a program. We probably had about 200 or 300 sightings of this smaller craft flying up and down the west coast of Britain. Not to be confused with the large triangular craft that hover, but nevertheless, the local media reported this as a UFO. And the reason the local media in the northwest reported it as a UFO is because that's what they were told by British Aerospace. No, we don't know anything about it. I actually saw this thing take off from a facility called Warton on the River Ribble. I actually saw it taking off, and so did about 12 other people see it taking off. We saw it under escort by RAF tornadoes. Friends of mine in Southport saw it under escort by RAF tornadoes. It was actually monitored by military communications monitors. Those are the people who listen to military communications alongside the coast. And they actually heard it actually being directed out at sea. One of the famous quotations from one of the pilots of a tornado aircraft sent out to sea to catch this thing, or to see what it was doing, was, "We have made contact with a triangle." Aliens? I don't think so. Humans? Very much so. There we are with that. And it just gives you the technical BS about what these things are. And then the big question, what would you do to cover up a project like that? Well, the first thing you want to do is shut Big Mouth here up. So what do? Firstly, you find out something to discredit him with, and you hit him with that. And that's what happened to me. I don't think anybody else in here has had a 150-page booklet written about how awful they are, what a terrible person they used to be, and you shouldn't take anything they say seriously. If that doesn't work, what's the next thing we do? We cancel your mortgage payments. We make funny phone calls to your house in the middle of the night. All this happened to me. And this is because I started to suggest that flying triangles were not alien craft, and that they were being flown from a number of locations in this country. One of them on the Scottish coast, called West Frew, which was part of the DERA, which is the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency, an agency, highly classified projects going on, which works hand in hand with the American military. And sometimes they use this country occasionally over the years, over the last 15, 20 years, to test their aircraft. And that is pretty much a fact. And it's a fact which is accepted by most people in the aviation research community, to the extent that somebody I was speaking to the other day, who will have to remain nameless, but is very high up in the aviation research community, a man who has written about 40 or 50 books on aircraft, told me that he thought that Nick Pope, the chap who used to work for the Ministry of Defence, was actually sent into the UFO community to divert attention away from the flights and testing of secret military projects by making the UFO community look elsewhere. There's one thing that all of these people in the 1990s, when ufology was really popular and it was on TV, were absolutely insistent about. They didn't mind if you thought you'd been on board a spacecraft. They didn't mind if you thought you had fairies at the garden. They didn't mind if they thought you'd been probed by aliens. They didn't mind if you thought you'd been on board a craft, or you were an alien hybrid. They didn't mind that. That was fine. Let's talk about it. Let's write a book. Let's put an article in the latest UFO magazine. But if you suggested that flying triangles or flying saucers were from Earth, you were in really big trouble. And this chap, Nick Pope, very nice bloke, spoken to lots of times, actually invited him to a talk at our UFO group. We had 400 people for that. It was a good night. Made us lots of money and enabled us to do some more research. The one thing he always insisted on, the one thing that Graham Birdsall always insisted on, and Tony Dodd, and all these people in the UFO community, was that these are not man-made. Didn't matter what else you believed, they were not man-made. And it was very interesting, particularly Graham Birdsall. He used to get in a real flap if he suggested they were military. It just couldn't be possible. And that's because they were having their years spent by people who worked for British Aerospace and other people to tell them that, you know, this is all alien, it's recovered technology. A fantastic cover. But anybody who looks into the reality of these things gets themselves into trouble. Now, it's okay, you don't have to worry, I've got a perfectly good job and I have lots of money these days, so obviously it was only a short-term thing. But it was effective at the time, because instead of looking at what you're saying about these things, people look at you. And that's one of the worst things about being involved in these kinds of subjects. It's not about whether you've discovered Bigfoot in Wolseley. Actually, he's out there, but don't let him know I said so. It's not about that. It's about whether you used to take drugs 30 years ago. That's what they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about you. They play the man, not the ball. My guilty secret was that 20 years ago I used to be a member of the BNP. I was as extremely right-wing as you can care to get. But that was then and this is now. Times change, people grow up, me included. So there I am talking all about UFOs. And people don't want to talk about UFOs, they want to talk about something we did for 6 months back in the 1980s. So anyway, that happened to me, and it wasn't very pleasant. And for 6 or 7 years, I didn't have any involvement in the UFO scene at all, apart from today, when I've come back from the grave, like a really bad nightmare, to talk to you about some of the reasons why we came to these conclusions about flying triangles. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, oh yes, but that doesn't explain the big ones, does it? The big triangles that hover. Bet you haven't got an explanation for that, have you, clever clogs? That's another one of the British Aerospace designs. Looks like a UFO, but isn't. There you go. Built by humans, covered up by humans. That's another British Aerospace thing. Interesting, you also have a picture of it flying over a desert, isn't it? I don't think we have any of those in this country, but that's a separate subject. There you go. It's an official British Aerospace picture. Looks like a UFO, not built by aliens. But we talk about the typical triangle sighting. Now, I know there's some people in this room who've actually seen these things, okay? And as long as it's not confused with an aircraft, then, which most flying triangle sightings are, we get this typical scenario of 3 white lights and a red one in the middle. Your typical UFO researcher will tell you that the middle is an anti-gravity device, back engineered from the Roswell craft, and somebody like me will tell you it's not that at all. But this is something designed in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It's a massive stealth airship, lighter than air vehicle. It has radar absorbent materials along the sides. It flies silently. It's up to 1,000 feet long. It can hover, and they fly these things in and around this country on occasions, and more particularly in America. And one was recently seen near Groom Lake, actually in the middle of a thunderstorm, which is a fascinating sighting, because one of the reasons to build these things was they could actually fly in inclement conditions. That is the original thing, massive flying triangle, delta-shaped, and you can tell by the trucks there how big this proposed thing was. It was developed by a company called Arion. You can see their logo on the side, and they did fly smaller models, test models of these things in 1971-72, which were responsible for UFO sightings at the time. Speaking of test aircraft, when they actually flew the first Vulcan bomber in this country, people rang up the police to say they'd seen an alien craft flying overhead. So that's how big these things are. Massive triangle, can't be built by humans? I beg to differ, of course it can. The only question is, what would they use this thing for? Well, this depends on how dark and deep you want to go. Some people believe they build flying triangles to listen to your communications and all that dark side stuff. Some people think it's for moving stuff from A to B. Well, I don't know. It's difficult to second guess the military, but nevertheless, that's a surveillance picture of an Arion craft as proposed in 1971-72. I spoke to the guy who run the company. They still do the designs for a thing called the Dynair ship, not the Dino ship. That would be good, nice and CFZ, wouldn't it? But no. And he told me he thought that the large flying triangles seen by people around the place were actually the results of his work and had basically been borrowed by the American military, by which we mean stolen, because the American military, when they're engaged in a highly classified project, do things their own way, which includes shutting up people who come to the wrong conclusions. So you won't see any articles in UFO publications about large deltoid, triangular-shaped airships, which have a number of different uses for the military and which are still classified. You'll hear about motherships and all the rest of it. And why do they want you to think that's a mothership? Because it means they can carry on. And the press is already full of alien stories, publications are full of alien stories, the TV is full of alien stories, the researchers by and large are confused, and everybody goes home happy, particularly the military, who spends a lot of money on these things. Now this is a very large V-shaped thing. Maybe you can work that out. This is one part of the V, the rest of the V is at the front, and there's another V on the left, another bit of the V on the left. It's a huge project to space called ATO, and it's being currently developed, and it's a very, very large thing. Bit of fun here. Something which they want to send to space, and I absolutely bet you that when it's seen, people will be reporting UFOs, okay? That's just one of these things. And there's a video, and that's my book at the end, because it is a bit of a revelation when you look into these different projects and you discover that you may have been told a pretty big lie, and that is that flying saucers and flying triangles certainly can be made by the military, have been admitted to be made by the military in documents previously classified, but they'll do anything to shut you up if you come to the wrong conclusions, and that some of the flying triangle and flying disc sightings that have been noted over the last 50 years are actually the work of humans, not aliens. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the names of the people who put out all these aliens and flying disc stories in the 1950s, many of them were former CIA or former Navy people. That's quite interesting and something which tends to be glossed over. They've actually invited some of them to do talks at UFO conferences. And funnily enough, the one thing they never talk to you about is how these things could be man-made. So there's lots and lots of information. It's not a perfect scenario. People like me, there's only a few of us, it's a good thing, isn't it, only have the briefest information to go on, and sometimes it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You have a number of different strands. It's very difficult to get that full picture because, surprisingly enough, we don't have people from military coming up to us and saying, you know, they're going to fly that thing at 2:15 on Friday night. That doesn't happen. That's because they want to keep it all secret. Why would they do this? Well, the military is generally a secretive organisation anyway. They don't think you have the right to know anything. You can argue about whether you do or not. That's not my thing to do. They spend amazing amounts of money on this secret technology. Why? Basically to maintain their control over anybody and everything. And they always need to have something in advance, do they not? The traditional F-117 stealth aircraft that's been featured on films and in documentaries has now actually retired from service, and yet it's still held up by people as being the apex of technology, and yet particular technologies that were responsible for that particular craft are now 40 years old. So the question is, what do they have now? Do they have anti-gravity type technologies? Well, if they do, that in itself would be a very good reason to keep all these things quiet. These flying triangular things, the small ones are still at the experimental stage, but they've definitely flown them and continue to fly them. And I suspect that one of the reasons they're so eager to keep it quiet is because of the range of technologies on board the aircraft, including, allegedly, the ability for these things to change to an invisible mode while they fly through the sky. That technology's been on the cards for about 20 years. And they've been working very, very hard on it, and you don't need to take my word for that. You can look in aviation magazines and publications to find that out. So as you can see, there's a lot of good technology you need to keep quiet, and that's probably part of the reason that they've kept the flying discs and flying triangles quiet for such a long time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap it up, because you've heard enough from me. Some of you might have questions, and some of you might want to sort of talk to me later on. As I say, it's a bit of a ropey speech, because this is the first one I've done for about 6 or 7 years, so you'll just have to forgive me for that. But hopefully, some of the things that I've said have made a little bit of sense. If not, I do apologise, but as I say, it's a free world, and I can tell you whatever I like. So thank you very much for being attentive and listening. And hope we didn't move around too far from our friend on the camera here to keep me in the right place. And I'd just like to thank you for listening. If you want to ask me a question now or outside, please feel free to do so. Any questions, anyone? Yes. Well, you were nearest.
John.
Do you have any further information about potential anti-gravity technology?
There's a number of different reports about anti-gravity technology. Some are on the internet. Well, everything's on the internet these days, isn't it? There are. I've seen a couple of others. I've probably seen 6. Okay. Most of them are stuff from the 1950s. Not sure why that would be. Maybe there's more advances that they've made. You will notice, I should just point out, that I didn't get into this whole business of anti-gravity Nazi flying saucers, because I think a lot of it's nonsense, to be honest with you. I just wanted to concentrate on stuff which we could see in black and white. There is more information, but I'm not an expert on it, if that's what you're asking.
At the bottom end of any technology, there's usually a bunch of stuff you can make with tin cans and brass and wire and so forth. Do you know of any experiments that work like this?
Yeah, there have been some, but it gets to the stage where, as far as I'm aware, some people can do these things in their garages. There's a guy in Canada, I can't remember all these people's names, I used to just know them off the top of my head, so you'll have to forgive me. And he's made small, obviously it's a homemade thing, small devices do all kinds of weird stuff in his house. He describes it as Tesla technology. I'm not sure whether it is that or not, but that was what his initial interest was. I can picture the guy, but I can't remember his name. There have been a number of experiments, as far as I'm aware, into anti-gravity, but if we're talking about things that people have done as a sort of semi-homemade project, I'm not sure what we could sort of expect from that. But it looks like, the best thing to say to that is that defence experts, people who spend all their time talking about this, strongly believe and are led to believe that these technologies exist. And I suppose the reason they keep them so secret is because of the potential. I don't know. But there have been a lot of reports about these kinds of technologies, but it's difficult to say how far they've got, simply because they're still highly classified. Anyone else? There's somebody at the back waving at me. Chap in red.
He's just friendly.
Just hold on to the microphone and you can ask the question.
Any other questions?
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry, Timothy.
It's all right, I'll let you off. Go on, man.
If you believe, I'm assuming you believe, that the governments are trying to perpetuate the myth of extraterrestrial vehicles, who is it they're trying to fool? Because if you're aware of this, then every other government in the world is going to be aware of this.
I suppose the truth is it doesn't really matter what I think. I mean, in terms of ufology, I'm in a really tiny minority of about 5. If you look at what happens when a UFO is seen, whatever it might be, in the media, what always happens. Have you ever seen the report, secret military craft gets tested under RAFS? Well, no, you don't. You see aliens. And I suppose that's because that's what people want on the one hand, and what's convenient for the government on the second hand. I think it's probably true to say that their cover for it is probably a lot more advanced than it used to be, and it probably, like God, moves in mysterious ways. But I think that most people, when you talk about UFOs, still believe, or would like to believe, they're alien. And I think that's probably quite convenient. It's probably one of the ways, but not the only one of the ways in which they maintain this thing from the 1940s and 50s. The only thing I can do is tell you what they say in their documents and what people say they did to keep the flying saucer thing quiet at the time, which might indicate an MO, modus operandi, for what they're doing today. But certainly the things that happened to me in terms of this triangle project were real things, they weren't made up. So if that's what they were prepared to do in 1999, 2000, that's not that long ago, is it? Who else has a question? Sorry, Karen.
Yes, it's interesting you bring up this issue of electrogravitics. I happen to know from personal experience that I've actually built these electrogravitics things. What they are, they're not gravitational in any way whatsoever. They're basically capacitors, which uses something called coronal discharge to ionize air and accelerate it from the positively charged terminal to the negatively charged terminal, thus generating thrust. They're actually very easy to build. All you need is a little bit of tin foil, a little bit of copper wire, and a little bit of balsa wood, and a 60,000 volt power supply. And you will kill yourself if you touch this thing. So I do not recommend anyone build these things unless they know something about high voltage electronics.
I was just thinking if we had something like that, we might not have taken 10 hours to get from Manchester to here. But
this is the problem. You see, electrogravitics has been discredited from the point of view of it being an actual anti-gravity technology, because when you put these things in a vacuum, they don't work. And also, there's a scaling effect. You know, if you try to build these things big enough to produce enough thrust to lift a sizable mass, you can't. You can't actually generate the necessary power. They're a toy, an experimental dead end, a physical anomaly, if that.
It's interesting that because some of the people who talked about those kinds of projects always said that they had all kinds of problems with them, which if what you say is true, that would add weight to it. You know what I mean? They wanted to do it, but they couldn't quite. So maybe that's true. In terms of the main place UFO is related to anti-gravity technology, I never thought that any of the Bob Lazar stuff really required there to be anti-gravity, whatever that is, because that's just not a very good term. I thought it could still be based on advanced propulsion systems, but not anti-gravity. Because you see, it's like I said before, when somebody sees a flying disc, or something that looks like a flying disc in their Area 51, they just think it's an alien spacecraft because that's what they were told. Whereas it's probably not that at all. Who else has a question? Yes, this chap here.
Okay, this isn't so much a question as an observation, but it turns out there's, apart from physical craft and the coronal discharge systems, there's another way to make it appear as if you've got a craft flying around at incredible speed, doing absolutely incredible aerobatics that a physical object can't do. What you do is you use a proton accelerator to give you a beam of protons. It turns out when you fire these through air, the things, they slow down over time. They slow down over a period of time, but they dump most of their energy right at the end of the slowing down period. So what you see is a glowing ball. And if you keep this thing moving around, vary the power so it goes further backwards and forwards from the sending device, and just shine it around like a big torch, then if you have this thing on an airbase, you park the vehicle so that you've got this thing in the back of behind the building, and you think, right, okay, it's gone dark, there's somebody over there, I've got our usual sky watchers out there, right, let's give them a show.
The men in deck chairs.
Yes, let's give them something that cannot possibly be physical craft, and that will really get the old sort of aliens thing. I tell you what, let's try and land it near one of the hangars as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. I mean, the point I was really trying to make with what I was saying was that some sightings, some of the best ones that people have talked about, particularly historically, would relate to something that was man-made, and just to really make the point that it could be done and that there was reasons why they might have wanted to cover it up, particularly with the Cold War logic. But you're absolutely right. I've always been of the opinion that sometimes it's a little bit too convenient that ufologists, when they're watching things, or these stealth watchers in America, just get shows of a little bit too much to believe, aren't they?
What could be done? There's a model aircraft club on Bail and Moor, one member of which reputedly, for a bet, got a toilet door to fly. Controllably fly. It didn't really work too well, but it
That wasn't the thing Tony Dodd saw, was it?
Well, this is just one. I
just wondered.
But toilet door flying around, that's going to be a UFO report, especially on Bail and Moor.
It was, yeah, exactly, because there was supposed to be an alien up there, wasn't there? 1987. Somebody put a model of a green thing on the top of the mall, sent it to Jenny Randall's, and there we had like close encounters of the fourth kind.
Bail Moor's a special case because it's right over the approach road from Leeds Bradford airports, and as such, if you see something strange up there, usual technique for West Yorkshire Police is to send a helicopter for a look. But there isn't enough vertical clearance between the approach road for Leeds Bradford and the top of the moor. So you either have to close down the approach road for Leeds Bradford Airport, then send a helicopter, or you don't bother with a helicopter. So there's all sorts of funny lights seen up there, just nobody bothers with it, just can't do anything.
And then if you're a UFO researcher, you think you've seen aliens. It's really scary, isn't it? Right, who else has a question? There's a lady, fine.
A fairly peripheral question, but still.
What makes you think I'll know the answer?
Well, why would the Americans choose to test their aircraft over our small, intensely, densely populated island when they have vast spaces, almost populated in their own country? I can understand having the aircraft stationed there because we're near Europe and Russia, etc., but why would they want to test them here?
Well, I think the thing is we're their best mates, aren't they? And it depends what they're using their things for. People have asked me this a lot, actually, and it depends on, firstly, which sightings you're talking about. Secondly, how near are they to a military base? Some of them are, some of them are inland, you're absolutely right. A lot of the sightings people have made of flying triangles when they're over, I mean, you've got to remember that, say we have 100 flying triangle reports, probably 2 of them are worth looking at, 98 of them are just an aircraft flying in. So a lot of the time people will say, quite rightly, well, if there's all these flying triangles and they're doing all this stuff, then why would they do that over there? Well, most of the sightings that I investigated, and I can only speak for myself and other people involved in this weird and wonderful thing of ours, were around military bases or out to sea. Now, that's just my part of it. That's not the whole picture, because I don't know the whole picture. But certainly they could get away with it, and they certainly did get away with it in Lancashire, because they were flying this thing around at different times during the day, including during the daytime. And basically what would happen is if there was any reports, people like me would get them and we'd investigate them, and then the media would get hold of the story and we would tell the media that a experimental aircraft was flying, and that's not what made it into the media. So in a way, if they're testing them over built-up areas for whatever reason, for surveillance, or to see what happens, who knows. But the point is that if that's what they're doing and they've got this cover story in place, then it doesn't really matter. They can do it anyway, and they have done. There's been lots of sightings in America of these huge triangular craft. There's some reasonably good video footage of some of them. And they're flying them over built-up areas, and they're flying them near to military bases. One of the most interesting studies that was done by one of the frontier science groups in America. They call themselves frontier science groups because they're not really at the frontier and they're not really scientists, but they like to think they are. I think it was called the National Institute for Discovery Science. I don't know quite what discovery science is. I mean, I thought science was all about discovery anyway. Was that they correlated all the flying triangle sightings in America where they thought there was reasonably good evidence to suggest a triangle had been seen, and where the military bases were. And it was amazing what correlation there was. Because obviously if you're using military facilities, you've got to fly this thing in and out, and how are you going to cover it up? You know, and that's probably the way they do it. Who else has a question?
Yeah, it's more of an observation, actually, Tim. One of the other things that they use the cover story for is the development of unmanned drones. I mean, I was told way back in 2000 that we were using unmanned drones to spy the IRA in Ireland, particularly in the case of the story I was told, it was for snipers. One of them crashed, special forces come in, and it was reported in the Belfast Telegraph as the crash of a UFO.
Yeah.
When the investigator it wasn't. but that's what it comes to.
And it's true, one of the things I didn't talk about with these unmanned aerial vehicles, they use them a lot now, and sometimes you can see footage of them from war zones on the TV, and because there's no pilot on board, they can definitely do much more extreme manoeuvres, because one of the reasons you can't always do extreme manoeuvres is if you've got a guy on board, you've got to be careful about his brain's not getting shaken out the sides of his head. But if there's nobody on board and it's literally being flown like a video game, which is how they do these things these days, then you can have much higher manoeuvrability. And the UAV thing's really, really interesting, but I didn't have time to talk about that, but I would have done if I had, so, yeah. Have we run out of time?
I think we have.
Well, at that point we shall end, and thank you once again for listening. And thank you to John for having the guts to invite evil little me to do this talk, because he's the only person in this country who has the guts to do it. So thank you, John.
I don't know why Tim is a very, very much maligned. Well, I do know perfectly well why he's maligned, but most of it isn't true. And even the bits which are true have been completely misrepresented. This man has been made out to be the most evil person in Forteana.
Oh, yes.
To be somewhere below Slobodan Milosevic on the likability scale. Somewhere, he's been made to be as popular as Ebola virus.
Yeah.
He's been one of my best mates for years. I'm very fond of him. I'm very, very glad that I finally managed to reveal him down the Wall Street for a weekend. So, ladies and gentlemen, Agent Matthews. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now have another event in the 14th year, the Great Computer Switchover Race. David, your time starts now, and while you're doing that,
I've done it!
You've done it already! David, I am so bloody proud of you, mate. Okay, Mr. Ronan, please. By the way, before Richard introduces our next guest,